everyone. You're watching We Heart Therapy, the special series EFT Talk. I'm your special host, Dr. Anabelle Bugatti, licensed marriage and family therapist and certified EFT supervisor and therapist here in fabulous Las Vegas. And we are welcoming to our show Elana Katz. She is one of our beloved EFT trainers in New York. She's actually responsible for bringing EFT externship training to New York. And she's a trainer. She trains both in the United States and internationally. And she just does some fabulous work. She's a licensed marriage and family therapist as well as a licensed clinical social worker. And she's a senior faculty member at the Ackerman Institute in New York, which is also fabulous. And we're welcoming her onto the show today. We're going to talk about learning EFT and the developing EFT therapist. So thank you, Elana, for being with us.
It's a pleasure to be with you. So I look forward to this conversation.
And I'm so excited because you were actually at my externship. So a lot of you guys don't know, I started with EFT in New York, and Elana was one of the trainers at the externship. So I've had an introduction with her before, and she's just fabulous. So
thank you.
About this topic, so EFT is deceptively simple, right?
Yes, that was the exact phrase that was coming to mind when you started. Yes.
Yeah, it's like we come away from the externship and we're like, yeah, I can do this. All right, I got this. Then we get into session and we're like, oh, I don't got this. It's fun, it's great, but it is a little bit more complex than we realize on the outset. So what are some commonalities that you find, or some common themes or blocks that you find come up with therapists as they start to learn EFT?
Well, first, I just want to say I appreciate being able to catch a breath on this topic, because for me, it's a little bit like taking our video camera and turning it around and focusing it on ourselves. We're always watching, what is the couple doing? What are our clients saying? What's happening to them? And there's a lot that I think is implicit in the training in EFT, and this is a chance to make explicit some of what the journey is like for us.
Which is what we're all about, right?
Right. We try to do that for our clients. Why can't we try to do that for ourselves? Right. So I've seen people approach this in different ways. For some people, it's, how do I just get all the information, right? If I just read enough books or saw enough tapes, could I possibly find a way to know it all, have it all in my head, right? This model, though, is an embodied model. And just like we ask our clients to feel something different inside so they can then do something different in their relationship, I don't think a person can really develop fully in EFT unless they have an embodied sense of how to deal with those feelings and how to feel your way into it. And that was really mind-bending for me.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that you're making, because in learning EFT, especially when you're really young in the EFT journey, your mind has to work a lot harder to remember the steps and the stages, the moves of the tango. So it feels like mentally we're really like two processes happen. We're busy thinking about where we are in the model and what our next step has to be. So we're kind of like away, but simultaneously having to be present to understand what we're seeing in front of us. And it's exhausting. And it feels like maybe we're trying to hold a bit too much intellectually, which we talk about all the time, is we don't want to engage the brain so much as we want to engage the whole body experience.
Right. And I think, one of my latest expressions, maybe because I've been hanging out, I'm from the Midwest, and I've been had the blessing of going back and doing some teaching of EFT in the Midwest most recently. And, I grew up driving, which I don't do in New York very much. And I talk about hugging the curb. Can we just hug the curb? I tell people that we are not lawyers. Lawyers are trained to never ask a question that you don't know the answer to, right? You would never want to be in a courtroom and be caught by surprise, right? And we are doing this complicated thing, which is we're using everything we know from our lives, from our experience, to conjecture what might be happening, but we also have to be prepared to be surprised. And we don't really have to know the answer to all our questions. We just have to find a way to lean in, hold close to our process. That by itself is mind-bending.
It
right?
kind of, you say that, it kind of reminds me of how we talk about in insecure attachment, how we have a shorter window of tolerance for the ambiguous. So if we don't feel secure in our EFT skills, then we get more scared by those surprise cues, like, surprise, I feel this way, or your client says this, and you're like, oh no, what do I do with that?
I was doing a live session, I think it was about a year and a half ago now, and the very good EFT therapist had presented the case to me and said, you know, the husband was the withdrawer, the wife was the pursuer, and I got somewhat deep into the session. I asked her something about what she was feeling, and she just looked at me and she went completely blank. And she said, I don't know what I feel. And for a quick moment, I thought, well, of course you know, you're the pursuer, right? And then I realized there was a bit more complexity there, which is this was a person who pursued on behalf of her children. She really didn't have much knowledge about her own interior emotional landscape.
Yes.
And it wasn't, she didn't give the wrong answer. She gave the right answer. I just wasn't prepared for it.
Yeah.
So I needed to be able to pivot with that and say, oh, and what's it like not to know what you feel, right? When you move through the world with such advocacy for your kids, what's it like to stop and check in and not feel, right? So I use that image a lot too. I always say I was never a fantastic tennis player, but I always like watching good tennis, and a good tennis player will pivot, right? They look like they don't move necessarily so much, but they have to be prepared to think, well, the ball might come here, but on the other hand, it might be over there. And I have to be prepared to go in any direction at any shot, right?
Yeah. So how do therapists learn, kind of as they develop their skills, how to be okay with those curveballs that may come their way and not freak out? Or I think a lot of us, especially early in the process, can tend to get lost when those curveballs come, and we might get a little dysregulated inside, like, uh-oh, I don't know what to do with this, and they lose their way, and then they start to go really cognitive and maybe start explaining.
So one of the things I like to talk about is, are there any ways in which we can take what I call our internal monologue and turn it into a dialogue? So if inside I'm saying to myself some version of, OMG, I don't get this, panic, you know, is there anything to say, oh, you know what? I don't think I didn't quite follow you there, but I want to. Can we just take another pass at this? So sometimes I will literally put words to that feeling. It calms the nervous system. It is an accurate reflection of what's happening for me. It gets me back in the room as opposed to up in my panicked head, you know. So that's one skill that I offer to people, if it's helpful, is say, if they're starting to feel that way, is there some version of that you can say out loud that will reconnect you with your clients? Does that make sense?
Really good. And it helps us, I love how it kind of helps us catch our breath for a second, right? So yeah, we may get a surprise response, and it sounds like, I don't know, what you're saying is give ourselves permission to feel lost for a second, just pause and hold it and make it explicit, like, oh, this is, you know, what's it like right here? I'm not quite sure I understand this, or I'm not quite sure I follow. Can we just stay here for a moment and see if we can better?
Exactly. Or sometimes I'll say, wow, something really fast just happened between the two of you. I didn't catch it. I know you both caught something.
Yeah.
Can I catch up with you? What just happened when you looked over and saw that expression on your partner's face? You know,
the interesting thing is too, when I check in with clients who give you those curveballs, you know, like, I don't know what I feel, which is common in caretakers because they focus outward and they don't focus inward. They're caring for everyone else at the neglect of themselves. But I found that oftentimes their partner has a similar experience where they're trying to get to their partner's needs and wants, and their partner often gives the same, I don't know. So it kind of gives permission and validation for the experiences they have at home, because we got to remember, this isn't new to our office. This happens at home too. So it really illuminates this part of this process where they themselves get lost in not knowing and don't know how to find their way back to feeling or bonding.
Or they're so flooded with feeling that they can't organize it, right? They don't, right? It can go either way.
Yeah. So are there so I know we talked about, as we develop, therapists also find their growth edges. And can you maybe define what a growth edge is?
So yeah, thank you. I think there are different ones for different practitioners. One of the things I talk about, I actually developed a program called the EFT Bootcamp, because I felt like there were people who had taken their externship, taken their core skills, done their supervision hours. Something was still missing. And there was a kind of freeze that went in between that and then trying to get certified, right? And so it got me very curious, like what was happening in our community and what might be some of the blocks that people were in. And one of the ones I like to hang out with a lot in a training like that, where I don't have the pressure to teach steps or tango, and I'm just turning the camera on us to think about what's happening inside, is I think a lot of therapists come to our field for very good reasons. We want to understand better how to do emotions and relational experiences, and we don't have such great models ourselves, or not such complete models ourselves, right? So we know we want this, but we don't necessarily have our own secure base to fall back on. And what happens then when we are supposed to hold up the lantern and help other people figure out how to do this emotional journey, when it's been one that kind of freezes us or freaks us out or gets us, stopped in our tracks ourselves. It's kind of a little bit like I say, hiring the decorator who's colorblind, they want to help, but there's certain things that are hard for them to see, are hard for them to know. So how do we grow that in ourselves explicitly? Just really take a moment to say, what happens to me when I get faced with a lot of emotion? So one of the exercises that I invite folks to try on, if they like, is to take a moment and pause and think, when I feel really angry, what do I most want from someone close to me, a close other? They might be partnered, they might not be partnered, so maybe it's a close friend, a colleague, a parent, a child. What do I most want, right, when I am angry? And then I ask them to write that out, all right? And then after about a minute and a half, I say, and when someone really close to me is angry, what is my default? What am I most likely to do, right?
Which light response.
And how do those two look side by side? And it's not that every person in our orbit wants the same thing we want, but it's just as a default. What do we most want? What do we most tend to offer, right? And how does that compare? And because I think many people are surprised when they do that little teeny exercise and say, wow, I kind of want it to get over. I want to shut it down. I want to, I want to find a way to make sense of it, And when I'm angry, what I really, just listen to me. Just stand by me. Don't look scared to death what I'm doing. Just be there with me, right?
I think, one of my first growth edges, I love that you're talking about this, very, very early. I think probably within my first couple months of just starting in practice with EFT, because I actually took my externship as an intern while in my master's program. So,
wow. Good for you.
Once I actually got in the room with my first few couples, I recognized that when I felt attacked, sometimes you have those really hostile pursuers who will turn they'll turn their cannon on you and start firing at you, the therapist. And I learned that my fight or flight was to go into fight mode, and I would fight back, which obviously in session is not going to bode well for the client.
It might work super well for you.
Yeah. I mean, it's validating for their partner, but the client, like, you know, it can cost that therapeutic relationship, which is not good, and they're not going to feel heard or understood. And so I had to work through with my supervisor, you know, what came alive for me when a client was getting angry towards me, and what was my relationship to anger. Right.
So to take a moment, really check in with ourselves on the different feelings that people can present. For many people, anger is a tough one. For others, you know, sadness is triggering. And how can we try to very intentionally grow that space? I personally think we don't do well to try to grow that solo. I think we grow that by, I always think it's great to have an attachment buddy when you're studying and learning EFT. So if you have a hard session, of course you can bring it to supervision, you can bring it to your trainings. But if you have somebody that is sort of like your lifeline, EFT lifeline support, that I can call you and say, that session was awful, or I was flooded, and you start to process, learn what it's like to really process for yourself with someone else. We co-regulate so much faster than we regulate on our own, exponentially so, right? That's foundational to our work, and it's true for us as well. Don't be alone with those difficult feelings. Have someone that you process that with, whether it is a study buddy, whether it's a supervisor, therapy partner. And sometimes for me, one of the most helpful things has been, to this day, if I have somebody I'm really struggling with, you know, somebody who maybe is on the edge of being abusive verbally, where I know my intention might be to want to shut that down. Before I can think about doing something different, I really have to try on that client. It helps me to practice being that person and having someone sit opposite me so I can feel what reaches me and what doesn't. You know, we need to be in the emotional place to learn how to do the emotional work.
That's
if Sue parachuted in right now on our call, she would say, we're all in the same turkey soup together, right? We heard her say that. And I think that's what she's saying. The emotions don't just belong to them on that side of the room. They're also us. We need practice with it. We need especially to allow ourselves opportunities to practice it when we're not sitting with our clients.
Yes. You know? I notice, you know, as a supervisor, that's usually one of the most common initial growth edges that come up with my supervisees, is that working with emotion. And I see this come up in core skills all the time, because sometimes you have people who come from more avoidant attachment styles, or they're big withdrawers. And so emotion can be really hard for them. So that's like, feels like a huge hill for them to climb initially. Is, how do I get comfortable being in the emotion? Because if I can't be comfortable, then when my client starts to go there, I'm going to exit and pull them out, and then we're not going to be able to stay where we need to stay.
Just being able to recognize that is definitely a piece of it, right? To realize, wow, look what happens to me. My pull is to exit, or my pull is to try to organize them, or my pull is to try to think, is there any way I could get out of this room a few minutes early, you know, and to just be with that, to just feel that, and have a place where you can feel those feelings, where you don't have an immediate pressure to respond, and to be a little, you know, how do we develop a little self-compassion that maybe we deserve, and for good reasons we need that practice, right?
Yeah, empathy for ourselves.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's interesting, like I notice, you know, some therapists are really gung-ho, they're really excited to clean out these corners. You know, attachment theory and EFT just have this way of, you know, arousing dusty corners of our emotional world, of our experiences that other models haven't quite touched. So new things will get triggered. And I have my supervisees kind of track their own cycle as they kind of go through the self of the therapist exercises. When you get triggered on the inside, or when something comes alive, what do you notice yourself doing? Oh, I do this. What do you tell yourself? And impact the client, right? How does that show up in your work and come alive in the therapy room? And it's been quite interesting for them. And it's a really good reflective exercise for them to recognize, oh, when I feel this way, this is what I might do in session, and this is how it's going to impact the work.
Exactly. It's a beautiful exercise. I love that you offer that to your supervisees. And I think what's interesting is for some folks, I find that it's easiest for them to lean into the people who are wired the way they are. And for some, it's tougher to lean into the ones who are wired. They get more impatient with some version of themselves
Yes.
in the room than with the other, which, and it all makes sense if we can just, slow down enough, have a place to reflect on that, to process, to be compassionately curious. That's what I say. We can, I really do believe we can say almost anything to anybody, depending on our tone of voice, and how we say it. And I believe we can also turn that around and be compassionately curious with ourselves. And it's ideally to learn to be that way without being harshly critical or irritated or demeaning when we need a moment for us.
Yeah. And being able to recognize when that moment comes up in session and be able to take a breath and say, can we just pause here for a second?
Yeah.
I got lost, Yeah. So, and it's a really exciting journey to learn EFT, even though it can be really daunting at times. And there's a lot of self-growth. And I notice these growing edges change, and different levels of your development will pop up different growth edges, right? So, one of the first things that I noticed, as we already talked about with working with emotion, how does that impact the work, and, what happens inside of the therapist, but also just parts with understanding the model. I love how you mentioned before, we kind of rush to absorb all this information. And certainly when I went through certification, I felt like I was following these prescriptive steps, but when I was going through my supervisor training last year, it wasn't even until then, I've been doing EFT for 5 years already, that parts of stage 2 just clicked in a much deeper way than they ever clicked before. And I actually felt a little embarrassed, like, oh, I've been doing EFT for 5 years and this just, but it just tells you the degree to which things sink in and click all over the place.
I think that's so well said, and it's so true. And we're forever, I think, getting a bit sharper also. So as the model, this beautiful model that Sue has developed, goes all over the world, and we have a chance to practice and to teach and to supervise, we also learn from experience. Like, is there some way to refine this? Is there some way we talk about, for example, I think a lot about, what I think is the step that most people skip over, the alliance, right? Yes. That's ABC. It's true of every model. We don't really need to spend a lot of time learning that, right? But when you're sitting with either an individual client who's particularly challenging for one reason or another, or a couple or a family, it's also true that it's easier to develop an alliance with some people than others.
Yes.
And I really like to include exercises in my teaching that are a bit of a setup for a couple where maybe there's one person that is easier for most of us to connect with than the other. So I have a role play, for example, in our core skills that we do, where couples been together for a long time, and one of the partners just experienced a loss in their family, and they started to do some group work around grief. And all of a sudden the window on emotions has just opened up in a whole new way. And they want to bring that home to their relationship. And the other partner is like they looks at them like they've grown two heads, you know, like all of a sudden you want to have a different landscape for the interior of our relationship. And I want our therapist to role play working with that couple, where it's probably going to be very gratifying for us that one person is now really tuned into this channel and really wants to do it. And how do we feel towards that person who is saying, you know, we had a long-term relationship, everything was good. Why does the fact that you lost one of your parents have to change the way we connect with each other? You know, so alliance can sound simple, but some clients are harder to connect with. And sometimes we have an alliance and then we fall out of alliance.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, one of the ways that I recognized, or, you know, one of my growth edges was one particular type of client I found was really hard to build an alliance with. And it was the kind that was so defended that even when you repeated their own words back to them, they're like, no, that's not. And you're like, but you just told me that. You know?
I have a lot of attorney clients who the being precise about what's been said or not said. So conjectures are not their best friend.
Yeah.
So it feels like you were saying yada da. No, it's almost like let the record reflect that I said this. I did not expand in that way, right? Yeah. So yes.
Yeah. And we kind of
how do we sit with that? What is that? What happens inside for us?
That panic. Uh-oh. I thought I was getting this right. I'm using their words. I'm using the whole bag of tricks that they told us in the EFT manual, and it's not working.
Nothing's working, right? Yeah.
Yeah. One of the other growth edges I noticed too is that when therapists are learning EFT, they're trying to find their niche or their flow. And, you know, learning the language of EFT is very nuanced. It's a very different way of speaking. Yes. I mean, the English language, but it, you know, it's all attachment. And I know a lot of therapists struggle with learning their language. And often I find that they'll, and I was guilty of this too, is they may try to copy like their favorite trainer or whatever. And sometimes they find like, oh, it just doesn't work for me. And, you know, one thing that I had to learn is that there's multiple right ways to do this, right?
Yes.
I'm not going to be Sue Johnson in session. So, you know, yeah, I may be able to borrow some things from her, but at the end of the day, I have to find what fits my personality and go with my own intuitive nature, because I'm the one who's going to be alive in the room. So, right. You know, giving people permission to develop themselves and knowing that it's not wrong. There are lots of ways to do this, and it's a mixed ingredient list. You know, when you're in session, you're the one who's feeling what's alive in the room. And while we may explore this, or we may explore this while we're watching a tape, you're the one who's actually there feeling it. So if you're leaning in, we got to trust that you must have had an instinct that something was popping up there. And so right. You went that way. Let's go with that. Let's talk about that, you know.
And I think at the beginning, I think it's really a part of the progression of developing your own EFT voice, because at the beginning, really all you have is to try to sound like you're the trainer who's teaching you, right? And I think one of the nice things about going to different trainings and having different exposures is it doesn't mean that you're going to sound exactly like any one of them, but there's something about hearing people do it differently. Yes. That I think creates that space.
Yes, I love that. It really helps you get like a smattering of styles, which right. I'm a fan of, because you find, what's interesting is you find that there is a commonality in the language that transcends the trainer's styles, but it is still nuanced in their style. And they may have some nuances that really fit for you. And our clients are very diverse. So I've learned that some of the warm fuzzy talk, which some of the trainers are brilliant at, just doesn't reach some of my clients. And they need more of that like technical, tactical language, which some of the other therapists, other trainers are good at. So
right. So it's learning the match for them, for what the client, what do these clients need from me in this moment, And then it's also learning to sort of find your own voice. And when you talked about developing the flow, I have to say, again, I'm back with my driving images, that I remember when, when you're learning driver's ed and they say, all right, one hand is at 10 and one is at 2, and you're going to be 10 feet for every 10 miles an hour, you're going to be a car length, and it's X number of feet before you get to the corner that you put on your signal. And you're trying to hold all these data points, right? And then at some point you're just driving.
Yeah.
At some point you're just driving, right? And you're not thinking about the 10 and the 2 and how many feet you are before you put on your signal, right? You're just doing it, right? And I think that that probably feels exactly right to some of our listeners, and for others it's like, I want to get to that point where I could feel that flow.
Yeah,
But I think people have had it with lots of other things they are already proficient in.
Yeah.
And
it's practice, like everything else. Practice makes perfect, and it's a continuing process. And so part of the growth edge thing, and as we mentioned earlier, different levels, as things start to sink in and you become more advanced, you'll have different growth edges popped up. I had a growth edge come up this year around language, is that I found my niche, but sometimes I felt like I would get in like my own little EFT machine, and it was well oiled, and then I'd kind of get stuck in this rut because it was just producing the same thing over, and I was losing some flexibility. So I had some of my most difficult cases to date come through this year, and some of them ended up leaving prematurely, and I felt like, well, yes, I can see that some of it was just their lack of desire to go into vulnerability. And, you find that sometimes with couples, oh, we got to do vulnerability. No, I'm out of here. But I also recognize, because I wanted to understand, what can I learn from this? How can I, improve my skills so that I can better serve these clients? And I learned that I think I was trying to confine them too much into my EFT box with my languaging. I can still keep them in the EFT lens, but adapt my language when they say things like, I want tools, even though we're 6 months in. And I'm like, you're not using the tools I'm giving you, But I learned that this was me like becoming rigid in my own languaging, that when I had a few odd, different clients come in, I wasn't being flexible enough to attune where we're at with my language.
That's so interesting, right? Like, how do we really listen? What do these clients need at this moment? Yeah. And can we, even as it's sort of like part of us wants to say, but I'm giving you so much, right? To say, you really want something to hold on to right now. You really want something that's going to absolutely work and carry you from this Tuesday to next Tuesday.
Yes.
And we can make sense of that, right?
Yeah. We don't have to change the model, but we can change our language that better attunes to what the client is expressing.
Right. And we can find a way to connect with, I think, and resonate with why they would be asking for that, right?
Yes. Yeah. And new clients will teach us new things, and, it will require our antennas to continuing, like when I think of like a TV, when you have that antenna, the bunny ears, and they have the digital bunny ears, and you actually have to like scan your TV with the tuner, we have to keep scanning our antenna, to pick up frequencies as we develop. And so it's good just to, not get rigid in our language and have that flexibility, which time, Yeah. So I also, maybe we can talk about how therapists will recognize that they've come up against a growth edge. But right before that, I do want to say, guys, that don't be embarrassed or ashamed if you feel like you've hit a growth edge. Expect this to be a part of your EFT journey, and you will get really good at certain things, and then you'll feel like you've just kind of plateaued and you're not breaking through. And at least for me, that's my own felt experience, that I might have hit a glass ceiling. And it doesn't mean I'm doing anything wrong. It means I've progressed and I've gotten better, that now my clientele or my skills are demanding that I learn and grow to a new level, a new higher place. So how would you also talk about that?
I think I think I love that invitation to say, let's just be attuned to your own blocks. So, you know, what comes up, which things seem to come more easily, which things are tougher. I always say to Sue, if I am a good teacher at all, it's probably because I was the very slowest learner. You know, I mean, this was very flooding to me, all this language of emotion. I was not in a relationship when I took my externship. So I sat there the whole week alternating between feeling like, oh my gosh, the most important thing in the world is this, you know, authentic, attuned, you know, response. And I'm not in a relationship. This is devastating, right? And so I would alternately feel terrible or check out, you know, so that was my externship, right? And I'm always amazed when people go through the externship and they actually have learned and retained things. So we have different pacings. We have different things that will trigger us. Again, finding the place for self-compassion. One of the things, I'm incredibly grateful to someone on our EFT listserv. I just don't know who the person is, but somewhere around 6 months ago, someone started a thread that said, how many couples is everybody seeing in a day? Because now that I'm 49, I'm feeling like I don't quite have the energy to just kind of see so many people in a day. And I was like, wow, somebody's asking that question at 49. This feels like a chance for me to reflect. You know, I hadn't even thought about that. But in this model, and I think you alluded to this early in our conversation, we are really letting our nervous system out on a regular basis. We're feeling we're in there. We're not just kind of looking down at folks on, you have a problem, right? We're feeling our way with them. And it touches something deep in us.
It takes a lot of energy to do EFT really well. Like, you have to be on your game.
You have to be on your game, and you have to be feeling your way. You know, just like, is this feeling it? No, that thing, you know, they're kind of nodding or looking like they're trying to go along with me, but I'm registering something here is in the way. So how do I really feel my way into that and be with our clients there? So some of it is also just looking at how much are we expecting of ourselves. And of course, I want to be aware that even that question is a question that I can ask from a place of privilege, that I have my own practice and I can structure my day and do a balance of clinical hours with couples or individuals, or and not everyone has that choice. Some people are in agencies with very high demands on them in terms of seeing a certain number of clients every day and a number of sessions every week. So
and even
we don't always have that choice. And I appreciate that as well.
Sometimes I even think the double bind of being in private practice is you always worry about the famine season. So when it's feast, you might tend to overwork yourself, even though you know you're in control, you know? So it's like, business has been slow lately, so I'm going to take this extra couple, even though it might, add extra to my day. And everybody's threshold is different. Some people can handle seeing 10 people in a day and maybe only 3 days a week, whereas other people, their limit is 6. It really depends. And I think the kind of case that you're seeing, if you have a couple that is much easier to work with than a client who's super highly escalated or has a lot of trauma, different peoples are going to stretch your window and use your energy in different amounts. So you kind of have to tune into yourself and figure out what works for you.
But what was very interesting to me about that thread on the listserv is that, as best I recall, the overwhelmingly common number that people came up with in terms of how many they could comfortably see was, they said I could see 4 to 5 couples in a day, and that was about it.
Yeah.
It's something to think about in terms of, if we can structure in any choice or any balance in our lives, to really be compassionate about just what it is like to lend out your nervous system on an hourly basis.
Yeah. And it's not a competition, guys. If you feel like you can only see 4 and you hear someone saying, oh, I can see 7, please don't feel like you're doing something wrong.
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly.
Yeah, everybody's window is different. So, and, so going back to the growing edges, it's very common for therapists, like I said, as you develop, as things sink in deeper, you might come back to places that you thought you knew or you do know, but you're stuck in a different way around because you emphasized it much deeper. And I've also noticed this too, is as I got stronger, my EFT skills, I had more complicated, increasingly more difficult and challenging cases. So
isn't it interesting how our clients find us at the right time? It's just stressful. But I think you're right. That edge will be different. For some people, especially at the beginning, I think it starts out as a conceptual edge. Do I really understand this? And depending on what models you've worked with before, it will either feel more organic or it will feel like there's a little bit of a struggle inside. I mean, people who've done a lot of Rogerian work will feel a lot of familiarity and comfort, right, when they start to do EFT. And someone who's been more strategic in an approach might really be challenged. Like, am I really doing something when I'm reflecting? That's actually doing therapy, right? So it's funny, I actually, I think for some people who've been systemically trained, the idea of focusing on a cycle makes sense. And for others, there really is a sense that, we're really going to understand the pathology of each person, and somebody might really be a problem, right? If I can, I'm going to try to show this to you on our screen. So this was a bag I made for our 10th anniversary of our 10th EFT workshop in New York. Can you see what it says? It says
raise it a little bit higher. Perfect. The cycle made me do it. That's great.
Yes. So, but for some people, that by itself, really getting a sense of the interdependency and the fact that we co-create something with another person, that by itself is an edge, right?
Yeah. It's beautiful. And really, I think the art of learning the edges is just that constant attunement to yourself, to where you're at, and really tuning in. Is this a self of the therapist block? Is this a block in the model and my conceptualization? Is there a part of the steps and stages that I'm noticing? And, don't be ashamed or embarrassed, guys. Like, still, I'm a supervisor, and sometimes I'm like, I'm stuck. And I do have that little moment where I almost I'm tempted to shame myself and say, oh, you're so stupid. You should know this. How can you help other people? But then I have to go back and remember, this is a new layer of understanding, and it's popping up because I've grown. And so I've got to be able to digest it.
Yes. Yeah. And sometimes we can be creative. Like, I just developed a new technique. I was kind of excited, and I've just been trying it out in the last couple months. And I call it my Columbo intervention. Do you remember Columbo from television?
Yes.
He always looked kind of disheveled, like he didn't quite know what was going on, but would always come in with just the... So I realized that for some clients, not the highly reactive ones, but for some who are on the more slower moving side, I like to take on the place of confusion. I like to, when I want them to reiterate something they just said or done that's valuable, I want to say, well, a few minutes ago, I realized you said something, and I think it was so big, I think I only got part of it. I remember you started saying, and then I might use their phrase, and then pause and look confused and let them tell it to me again, right? Because it anchors it, I feel, more deeply if they repeat it to me than if I repeat it to them.
Yeah.
For some clients. So, as you say, our clients teach us what they need, what works, what doesn't. So, but that's what I'm playing with now is my Columbo intervention.
That's terrific. That's beautiful. That art of I'm confused. I'm not sure I quite got all that. And it is important to try to get it from the client. That's more experiential than for us to just logically explain it to them.
Exactly.
Yeah. And just like our clients are learning their cycle and learning the model in their way, we're learning it the same way. So it'll digest with them in layers. It'll digest with us in layers. So do you have any words of advice or encouragement for therapists that are on this journey that are coming up against their growth edges? What would you recommend beyond the things that we've already discussed?
I think I would just take my EFT highlighter over what we've said. I think, be compassionate, find somebody to process it with. Don't try to go it alone. Just realize that, as I have an Irish friend who says there's an Irish expression: a problem shared is a problem halved.
Yeah.
Which I like also. I think that's very EFT. There is something about sharing it with someone else. When you get stuck, that can be so helpful, right?
Sometimes just saying it out loud. I used to call my process partner when I first learned EFT almost every day that I was in session. I was like, help, I'm stuck.
Yes.
And they were so willing to be there. And we were about the same place in EFT, but my partner listened to a lot of podcasts. And so we were able to digest and help each other learn and grow, but it was so helpful. So I totally get a process partner.
And sometimes then we can start to carry them inside ourselves. We can start to say, even if you can't reach that person in that moment, what would they say? What would they say now? How would they respond to my worry or my concern?
Yeah, that's so funny that you say that, because that was when I was able to do that was when I first finally gave myself credit for knowing more than I was giving myself credit for. If I put this on the listserv, what would I imagine people would say back to me? And if I could respond with that question, I'm like, okay, maybe I actually know more than I give myself credit for.
Maybe so, right?
And my original EFT supervisor is still the voice in my head. Like, she's my secure base. And still, when I think of things, I imagine it in her voice.
Perfect. That's beautiful.
Yeah. So, Elana, do you teach workshops on the developing EFT therapist?
So yes, I have developed this program, the EFT boot camp, for people to really focus in on themselves and their own development. And I'm happy if people are listening and would like me to come to their community. I'd be very happy to chat with them about that, because I've done it here and I've done it on the road. And it's just a chance to hang out in this space and think about us as we're building ourselves.
Of that EFT boot camp. I think we all need that. Even as a seasoned EFTer, I still love boot camp. EFT boot camp. So do you have a website? Have you written any books? How can folks find you?
So the best way to find me is either on the Ackerman website, and ackerman.org. I'm also on the NICEFT website, niceft.org. And you'll find me, and I'd certainly be glad to hear from folks if this has been of interest, because I always like to keep my ear to what helps us do this work, this beautiful model.
Yeah. Can they email you on the websites?
Yes, you can absolutely email me, and my email is really simple. It's elanakatz@gmail.com. So.
At gmail.com. And I will make sure that I put your email address along with NICEFT and the Ackerman Institute's website in the description for this video. So you guys can just hit the drop down and click away and go right to their website. Perfect. Phenomenal. Perfect. And Elana, you are just absolutely amazing. And I love this idea of boot camp. Guys, look her up, have her come to your area and do an EFT boot camp. It will be a lifesaver.
Thank you so much. And it's just been such a pleasure to talk with you and to connect with you and just reflect back on all these important pieces of what we do.
You are so welcome. And you and I have some other exciting topics that are in the works. So guys, expect to see Elana again on our show. So thank you again just so much for your time and your expertise and just all of the wonderful work you do for us in the EFT community.
You're most welcome.
And thank you so much to our viewers. Guys, make sure that you hit subscribe because more videos are on the way.